Look at learning rate algorithms, and one of the algorithms we were taking a look at is called the momentum. And concept-wise, the idea was if we have a higher gradient, right? We want to do fast updates. Okay, as the gradient becomes less, based on the past history, we will also will slow down a little bit. However, the way this momentum is designed is, if we take a look at the equations, right? Just like I was explaining before the break, in the beginning, this part is 0. So in the very beginning, this is completely out. And if you now substitute this over in this part, so you can see it is the same as the original. Okay. So this is a standard technique in math. For example, let's say we have some function f of x. As x keeps changing 1, 2, and so on. Okay, or let me call it f of t, some t, right? Okay, so if we wanted to take into account the past history to some extent, we typically do something like this: f of t equal to f of something like this, f of t plus 1 equal to f of t plus, let's say, some gamma, lambda, whatever. Let me make it gamma of the old value, let's say f of t minus 1. Okay. So we discount the previous value by some, and this is usually less than 1, like 0.9, 0.95 or whatever. So this way we have an idea of the past history. So in the case of the gradient, what we want to do is, if the past gradient was high, okay, and the current gradient is, let's say, not as much, we still want to make it a little bit longer because we know in the past. So instead of just looking at the current gradient and updating the theta, which is what the original does, theta minus j of theta, right? So the original only takes a look at the current gradient to update the w, update the parameter model. But what this is going to do is take a look at the past history discounted by gamma, so that instead of, if the current is this one, according to momentum, it will actually become a little longer. It will go, so it will speed up the adjustment of the parameters a little bit more, right? Okay, but like I said, the downside is, because we are accelerating, we are, so if we had some situation like this, it may come pretty fast down, but then it may oscillate here a little bit. So the next algorithm you will see, try to take into account, and rather than just looking at the past, take a look at what will be the future gradient and try to adjust it. So
will it be mostly settled down in the local minima?
All of these have a possibility of settling down in the local minima, but if we take a look at a very deep network with lots of layers, lots of neurons, then what happens is, I should draw it a little bit better. It comes out. Okay, so the local minimas, it doesn't matter which local minima we go to, they are all equally, or they're all fairly close to each other. So, so getting trapped in a local minima for deep networks is not that big of an issue. But how we don't want to oscillate around here because then we are wasting time, right? So that was the idea here. Take a look at the previous gradient, discounted by gamma. So anyway, now let's take a look at the next algorithm, which is the Nesterov accelerated gradient. Here, like I was saying, the fundamental idea is like this. Let's say we went from here to here, then here to here, right? So what will be our future gradient, okay? So remember the theta is adjusted by theta minus, in this particular terminology, theta, delta of theta, j of theta, right? Okay, so this will be the updated value of the theta. So if theta is on this axis, okay. So pretend theta will turn out to be over here. Okay, after we do the update, right? Okay, so in the Nesterov accelerated gradient, what we are going to do is, we are going to try to take a look at the gradient at this position and accordingly adjust. For example, let's say the gradient here is further going down. Then it's okay to make this estimate a little bit longer. But if the gradient is slowing down, gradient is becoming more like a flat, then we will not go as much, we will go a little less over here. So how do we do that? We know this will be the new value of theta, so let me call this theta new. Okay, so what we can do is simply compute the j at theta new, and accordingly adjust the update of the theta. So let me show you, they have a nice picture over here. Okay, so if you take a look over here, previously, what was this part over here? It was just the theta. Okay, we replaced it by, essentially this is theta new. What will be the net effect of this? The net effect of this will be, like I was saying, suppose we move the theta here, then right at this point we determine the gradient is basically, let's say, going in this direction. Okay, so this is the theta new, the delta of theta at theta new, let's suppose happens to be something like this. So delta of theta at j of theta new. Suppose it happens to be here, right? So rather than updating our theta, see previously we'd have simply gone somewhere over here. Now what we will do is we'll go over here. Because we know the future gradient is moving in this direction, why not we also move in that direction? So that essentially is the Nesterov momentum, the accelerated momentum. Okay, so same thing as a momentum, but the difference is the j, the loss function is being computed as a future value, and based on whatever that momentum is given to us, we will adjust the theta. Okay. And pictorially, the author also shows a picture. Okay, take a look over here. Okay, let's say this is the current gradient. Okay, this is the future gradient. Then as we add the two, do a vector addition, this is how we will adjust the theta. So this will be our adjustment or our computation. So anyway, so this green part over here is how it will behave. Whereas if we were not using the adjustment according to the future gradient, then most likely what it will do is it will go here, then it will go here, then it might go somewhere over here. So rather than ending over here, we are adjusting because we're taking a look at the future of the future theta, and based on that we compute the gradient at that future theta.
Sir,
Yes.
working on the learning rate, will it ultimately, reduce the, what you call, the number of required training samples?
No, not the number of training samples, the number of epochs. Because if you recall, we typically go like this for I equal to 0 to number of epochs, right? Oops. Okay, so then we go basically for j equal to, let's say, 0 to training bit size divided by batch size, right? Okay, and over here, based on our learning rate, we keep adjusting the weights. But if we are picking the learning rate in a smart way, according to these algorithms, then this will end up, previously if we picked very less learning rate to begin with, suppose previously we needed 2,000 iterations over here. With the proper alpha, we may only need to go, let's say, 500 instead of 2,000. Okay, so that was the idea behind. Okay, so the previous algorithms, if you take a look over here, all the previous algorithms are adjusting all the W's. So all the weights and all the biases, they use same learning rate. Okay, so the idea over here was, let's try to adjust the learning rate according to individual weight and according to individual bias. So if we go down here, so eta grad, okay, so anyway, let me see if I can show you. Okay, so here, if we define gt of I as the gradient with respect to I, so I is, for example, one of the weights. So I could be one. So theta of I could be one of the weights. And t is our iteration, so t plus 1, t plus 2, as we are going through our training data, through each batch, we just keep the t is incremented, right? So gt of I, so think of lowercase g as the gradient. So gradient with respect to I at some time t. Okay, if that's the definition of the gradient. Then if you take a look at the regular SGD, regardless it's batch or not, this is the regular SGD, theta ti, right? Every weight, every bias is being updated according to this rule, okay? So now, like I said, what we want to do is we want to adjust this learning rate so that based on how quickly or how less quickly a particular weight is changing, we should make it higher or lower accordingly. So again, if let's say according to one of the weights, if the change is greater, obviously the learning rate should be higher. If we come to, let's say, like this part over here, where the gradient is becoming less, then the learning rate also should become small, because we want to make sure we get to the minimum and not just start to oscillate over here. Okay, so anyway, this is the standard SVD. So now let's take a look at what does eta grad do. Eta grad is very simple. Now take a look over here. This is the main update for eta grad for every individual weight and every individual bias. Okay. So theta T of I minus learning rate. If you take a look over here, what are we dividing it by? So GTI I is essentially, like, remember the definition of this was the gradient with respect to some weight I or bias I, right? So in the denominator, we let's pick an example of W1. Okay, so let's say W1 started with 0.83, then it went to 0.71, then it went to let's say 0.65. So this is how, let's pretend W1 is changing. Okay. Now the gradient of W1, okay, this is what we are calling GT of I. Okay, and let's pretend this is changing as 0.11, 0.09, 0.07. So this GT of II is basically the sum of the squares. So this will be 0.11 squared plus 0.09 squared plus 0.07 squared square root is the definition of this GT of II. And what is epsilon over here? This is some small number, for example, 10 to the negative 8. You know, just in case the slope becomes 0 over here, remember this is the gradient. So it is possible that this may, in some cases, you know, as we go over here, it flattens out. It may become 0. So anything divided by 0, you can see, will become infinity. So this is simply to make sure the computation produces a valid result and not, you know, some runs into an overflow. Okay, so essentially what we are doing is keeping track of the past history of the gradients for each weight or each bias, adding them, doing the square root up to that point, and then adjusting this learning rate. Okay, so to understand it, you know, let's pick a simple example. Okay, let's pretend the gradient right now is, so W equal to, let me make it W1 equal to W1 minus learning rate, let's say 0.1 divided by, okay, in the, so in the beginning, okay, let's say this is GT of I. So in the very beginning, this will also be GTI squared square root. So as you can see, GTI square root gets pretty much get cancelled, right? So there's something missing over here. There should be, because second time onwards, I know it will work. Second time onwards, because then, as you can see, this will become 0.11 square plus 0.09 square, and this might be 0.09. So anyway, so essentially, based on the past history of gradients, we are adjusting the learning learning rate. And so let me ask you one question over here. Okay, the gradient could be positive, so GT of I could be positive, could be negative. This essentially is our learning rate, right? That we are adjusting. Because GT of I, by definition, remember this is delta of theta of I, J of theta, correct? So this is just a gradient, and this is the new learning rate. If you take a look at this new learning rate, let's pretend we started eta with 0.1.
So it's positive.
Okay, so my question is, will the learning rate always keep decreasing? Or will it increase sometimes? It will keep decreasing, right? So again, the idea is start it high, then gradually make it slower as we approach our because this is a past history of the square of the gradients. So this number, as you can see, will always become bigger and bigger. And because this is the square of the gradient, you know, for example, 0.11 square plus 0.09 square plus, right? So even if we were over here, next time as we go through one more time, even if it is 0.03 square, you can see it's adding to this value. Okay, so this will keep becoming bigger and bigger. Everybody agrees? So now let me ask you another question. What happens if we are running something for thousands of epochs? What will happen to the learning rate? It will become practically zero. So we'll stop learning, right? So that's the downside of this eta grad algorithm. So in the next algorithm, we make sure that this does not get very, very low. So that's the motivation behind the next algorithm. And by the way, in the matrix form, even though it's doing an individual update, each one has a different learning rate, each weight has a different learning rate, each bias has a different learning rate, but in matrix form, this becomes GT. So this is an n by n matrix. And so previously, if this was the first gradient with respect to the weight was 0.11 square, then this is how it will be. Then let's say 0.09 square. So only the diagonals over here are the values. So to give you an example, let's say we're taking a look at let's say the biases. And let's say we have 100 neurons, so will the size of this be 100 by 1? Right? So then this will also come out to be 100 by 100. You guys agree? Because only the diagonals are the squared value of the previous gradients. And then times g of t, which is the current value of the gradient. So if we do, so if there were 100 biases, there will be 100, you can see it will be 100 by 1. So the dimensions will easily match, you can easily verify it. So even though our goal was every weight and every bias should have its own learning rate, we are still doing one matrix by vector operation.
But didn't you say that this dot with a circle is the multiplication element-wise? Shouldn't it be like...
Okay, let me think. Okay, yeah, you have a good point. Let me see. Okay, suppose, again, let me go into two cases, one for the weights, one for the biases. Let's see if it works. Suppose our weight matrix is 100 by 10. So this will be 100 by 10, agreed? This will be 100 by 10. Okay, this will be 100 by 100. Let me see, why will it be 100 by 10 for GT is the gradient, so the gradient has to be 100 by 10. So GT has to be 100 by 10. This should also be 100 by 10.
Professor, but don't we store the parameter theta as a vector or as a matrix, even irrespective of how many weights do we have?
It's a good point, let me think. If we,
Because the weights are the ones that map us to a different layer, but our parameters can be written as a vector.
okay, let me read the description. Yeah, you have a good point. Let me just see if that's the case. Let's take a look at the definition of the GT. GT contains sum of the square of the past gradient with respect to parameters theta along its diagonal. Along its diagonal. And I know GT is a square matrix, I think. Double check. So if you take a look at GT, is a D by D. So coming back, see, I've programmed it in the past. I'll have to take a look at the code that I had written. I thought the nice thing, if I remember correctly, was we did not have to, see, otherwise, if we follow your suggestion, if we have a weight matrix 100 by 10, we'll have to convert it to a vector like 1000 by 1, right? As we implement.
Yeah.
But the way I remember is when I coded it some time ago, the beauty was these did not need to be changed. Did not need to be transformed over here. So if this is 100 by 10 as an example, this will be 100 by 10. Okay, so GT.
What do they represent with this dot, the matrix?
Okay, so in this case, okay, if we try to satisfy the dimensions, GT has to be 100 by 10, then this has to be 100 by 100. Do you guys agree? Okay, so
That works, because you get the result 100 by 10, 100 by 10 minus 100 by 10, that can be done, and the result is 100 by 10.
but the problem is, what exactly is GT then?
Exactly.
Okay, let me double check my code. I can clarify to you guys next time how it was. But so as of now, we do have a confusion. What exactly is GT? Because if we have 100 by 10, in my mind, there should be 100 by 10 history of the past squared gradients. So I'll verify that. Okay, so anyway, there's eta delta, and this one, like I said, as we discussed, if this term keeps over a period of time, this keeps getting bigger, right? Then obviously the learning rate will go to 0. So eta delta basically will take care of, make sure as we go over a period of time, it doesn't become 0. So here, as you can see, the gamma is being used. So again, so that the past history, basically, if gamma is 0.9, the past history will, after a while, will not be added further. So maybe we are, let's say, if we add 10 gradients, we are up to here, right? But this gamma will keep getting multiplied by 0.9, 0.9. So after a while, as you can see, whatever the past is, it will not contribute as much. So that's the only idea over here. And just by using a gamma, 1 minus gamma to the current gradient, so 0.9 for the history, if this is 0.9, 0.1 times the current gradient over here, if we do this, then if we use this expression in our update, then you can see okay, so then this becomes, so this was the previous algorithm, and the eta delta becomes like this over here. So at the bottom, and this is because its previous history is being discounted by 0.9 each time. So you can see it will not keep growing because after a certain point in time, the previous values will hardly contribute to over here. Okay, so now let me come to, I think we can skip this one. We can skip this one. Again, the same idea you can see in RMS prop. Okay, previous history is, again, they just fixed it rather than giving it a gamma as a variable parameter. Otherwise, it's exactly the same as before. Okay, so Adam is the most important one. So this is what we need to understand, and that you will be actually in your next assignment programming it yourself. Don't worry, I'll give you all the starting code, and if you get stuck, I'll give you my implementation. So, so here the idea is we take a look at the previous, if you just focus on this expression, right? Once again, to refresh your memory, what is g of t? This is the gradient with respect to either the weight or the bias. Okay. What is beta 1? Let's pretend beta 1 is a parameter like 0.9. So what is this MT going to do? Isn't it going to take a look at the past history of gradients forever, or gradually decay them? It will decay them, right? Very similarly, now take a look at the BT term. Okay, what's the difference between MT and BT? And again, assume beta 2 will be, let's say, 0.95, doesn't matter. So it's also decaying the past history of the gradients or the square of the gradients? Square of the gradients over here, right? So we will use both because gradient could be positive, could be negative. The square will always be positive, right?